Thank you, Pastor Natalie, and thank you, Wesley, for that. Um, so the story that the teachings that we heard, Kianush read for us, and then Pastor Natalie reflect upon, they are maybe for you, one of these words might be some of the most familiar teachings of Jesus for you or to you. To love God with all yourself and to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that's not to say that Christians model it with the same familiarity as they know it. But the fun part about something really familiar is that it opens up this challenge to look at these words of Jesus and try to find something that refracts light a little bit differently in a new way, while still remaining true and faithful to what Jesus was saying. So as I was thinking about it this week, I thought we would look at these at these words very briefly through the lens of grammar. And honestly, many of you are much more faithful to grammatical rules than I. Or is it me? Or is it myself? But think with me for just a moment, and it won't be the entire homily, but think with me for just a moment about love and grammar. If you'll recall, we have in the English language, in languages, subjects and verbs. So I am, you see, God loves. And then this is basic, but the more complex a sentence becomes, the more components you have, parts of speech that you have in the sentence. And so you might have something like a direct object. And I know all of you know what direct objects are, so I'm not going to ask someone to speak up now. But for those that maybe need a refresher from 7th grade English or 3rd grade English, whatever, I don't even remember when we learned about these, but a direct object is receiving the action of the subject. So you hired me. I'm the direct object. I made ramen. Ramen noodles are the direct object. Zoe loves lamb chops. Lamb chops is the unfortunate direct object. God loves you. You are the recipient of God's action. While God's love can't be boiled down to English grammar, it's one way of thinking about it differently, for sure. Love is always seeking a direct object. God is love. So by nature, at least through this temporary grammatical lens, God is always seeking a recipient of God's action, of God's love. It needs a landing spot, a location, an object of God's affection and care. God loves you. God loves the world. It's a bit like light and how it travels across our world, across space. It just goes and goes, and it illuminates when it hits objects, but it's always in search of an object that it reflects upon, or that it refracts, or that it will be refracted by. And it's similarly, I think of God's love, it's ever expanding, forever it goes, perpetually, on and on. It's part of God's being. God is compelled to share God's self always. I know that's pulling a lot out of English grammar. So think with me for a minute then about a different component. Let's think about the radio. So your grammar lesson is over. We'll turn to Communications 101. And last week, we had our drive-in service. So you may have been there in the parking lot with us, or you were joining over Zoom or Facebook Live. And we had a blast. It was a delight. It was so good to see everyone, to tune in to FBC Woo on KWOO AM 1010. A couple weeks before the service, Wesley and I were trying to figure out the right station to use, and then Gail helped us as well. And so Wesley had had rigged up this incredible antenna with PVC pipe and everything. And then I would drive around the parking lot, and then later on in the week, Gail drove around in the parking lot, just trying to see how far it would reach on this AM radio station that we were transmitting through. But the way the transmitter works is you have to find an empty AM station to be able to use, to be able to broadcast within those 150 feet. And so I turned to this button that most of us have. I don't know that every car radio has it, but there's a scan button. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but you hit it. If you're not familiar, you hit the scan button, and it's searching for all the stations that have programs that are going on. So 1010 didn't have one, so it just scrolled through. I think it's 1030 or 1040. There's some local AM station with the news, and it stopped there because there was a program. And then you can hit the button again and it'll keep going, or for some cars, it keeps going after 5 seconds until you stop it. But either way, it is scanning until it finds a station. So we had to actually do it backwards and just make a note of the stations it landed on. And then we knew that stations on the other side of that were open. But as I was thinking about love, through grammar or as light, I was thinking about it like this scanning button, that's what love is like. It is always scanning, always searching for, in this case, for a radio station program, but love is always going out, trying to find a landing spot, a location, a recipient of love. Love then is not just a one-time action, but it's perpetual. By its essence, by God's essence, it's always seeking out. Seeking a what or a whom. But maybe that's a lot to pull from a car radio. So let's zoom out then and zoom up to 30,000 feet. And we'll hop aboard a plane, and your communications class is now dismissed, and we'll have our next elective class is Aeronautics 901. In reality, this next metaphor has nothing to do with flying a plane, but I just like the name of the class. But think about every time you fly, for those of you who have had the opportunity to be on a plane before. You have the flight attendants, and they're running through the stuff at the beginning before you take off. And most of the procedures they run through are in case of emergency, except for the seatbelt thing. Somehow there are still people, I guess, who have not encountered seatbelts. But otherwise, everything's about emergencies, a life vest or the oxygen masks. And what do they say about the oxygen masks? That if we encounter a disturbance in the cabin pressure, the mask will come down. And what do they say? They say to be sure to put it on yourself first, which we're all becoming accustomed to masks anyway, but a different kind of mask. But you put it on yourself first before you help anyone next to you who might need assistance. And I guess the thinking is that you can't help someone if you pass out first. So this is what I picture when I hear and read these teachings of Jesus. This is what I pictured, that we love God with all of ourselves, and we love our neighbors as ourselves. And in this moment of crisis in a plane, heaven forbid we ever encounter it, do you think that you'll ever doubt that there's oxygen in the mask, or will you just go ahead and put it on? I feel like you'll just put it on, and maybe you'll hope and trust, but you're not going to not put it on. And I've been thinking about how God's love is like that oxygen that we put it on, and it feeds us. It's our source. And then after you put the mask on, and there's someone next to you in need, whether it's a child or anybody else, do you think that you would consider whether they deserve to be helped, or would you just do it? I think once you've tended to your needs, as Zoe barks in the background, but once you've tended to your needs, you'll help them with all that you have, with everything you can muster to help them be safe. And I wonder, do you then begin to worry, or would you begin to worry if there's enough oxygen in the whole plane in that system that maybe you wouldn't help them because you don't want to run out? I don't think so. I think you'd just do it. You'd help them. And I think it fits really well with this idea of loving God and loving our neighbors, because God's love never runs out. When we're connected to this source of love, God's love infuses us with the capacity and the necessity to find recipients of that love, not just in a moment of crisis or, and this is maybe where the metaphor breaks down a little bit, but always we're, by our being made in God's image, by our being beloved children of God, by the Spirit of God that is dwelling within us, we are compelled in our being to always be seeking recipients of the love of God in us. And unfortunately, our culture, our practices, our priorities and pressures, and even our faith traditions and partisan beliefs and economic practices have conditioned us to think of ourselves first, foremost, and oftentimes only. We should care about our well-being. We should put the mask on ourselves, but not to the exclusion of others, not stopping helping putting a mask on someone else. We put the mask on ourselves, but we don't stop there. That impulse to help others shows up in moments of crisis and hurricanes and floods and tornadoes and pandemics in an airplane. To love in those moments with our actions, it's our innate goodness that God has inspired and breathed into us from creation. But the work that Jesus is calling us to in these teachings, in this teaching, is to peel away all the extra baggage and distractions and comforts and ways of living that inhibit that goodness and love from searching on, from scanning out, from reflecting on. It's sort of like light under a bushel. Our culture or our partisan priorities or religious traditions or economic practices often inhibit us or prohibit us from truly loving others as a part of our being, as a part of God's being. So what do we do then with that? How do we work through that? And I think that's where the first part of Jesus' answer really illuminates this second part of loving our neighbors. We must love God with all of ourselves, our heart, our souls, our minds, like we heard Pastor Natalie speaking about. We must be actively mindful of how other things, stuff, prevents us from fully loving God with all of ourselves. We have all kinds of stuff in our lives that hold us back or down or push us in different directions. So we must be consciously mindful and we must actively work to love God with our full selves. And then when we do this, it's like we put on that oxygen mask and we're in sync with God's love. And this love is infusing us to be just as ongoing and continuous in our love for others. It's how we are inspired and compelled to move in our world with and toward others. We must be consciously mindful and we must actively work to shed ourselves of those priorities or practices or beliefs that hold back the love within us from searching out, from scanning out for recipients. We must remove that bushel that hides our light, whatever it is for us. If it's a certain political belief, if it's a certain religious belief, if it's a certain economic practice that you have for yourself that keeps you from loving others well, we have to remove that so that our light, our love, God's love that is in us can continue to move us forward. So what I want to do is we move into our time of prayer now. We've done this in the past in person before, where you write down on a little note card, a little, whatever the prompt is, you write down a little answer and then we read those together. We can't quite do that in this case, but I thought we could use the chat. And so what I want to invite you to do for just a moment is to reflect on what it is that might be holding you back a bit from your natural, from the God-infused way of living of love that just always wants to love and find people instead of just a one-time action. It's this perpetual existence and way of being, but that we cramp down with different stuff, different priorities and things. What are some of those priorities that you need to remove? And if that's too vulnerable to name in the chat, then Uh, I think another way of looking at it is to ask yourself, how can I love my neighbors with my full self this week?